The rain fell in sheets across the English countryside that October morning in 1944, turning the training grounds of Camp Tidworth into a muddy quagmire that clung to boots and soaked through wool uniforms. Private First Class James Mitchell stood at attention with the rest of his platoon, water streaming down his steel helmet and dripping from the edge of his collar. But he didn't move. He had learned not to move. In the 8 months since he'd left Nebraska, the army had taught him that much: how to stand still when everything inside him wanted to run, how to load a rifle in 30 seconds flat, how to sleep standing up if necessary, and how to write letters home that sounded hopeful, even when hope seemed like a luxury, reserved for people who weren't about to cross the English Channel into Nazi-occupied Europe. Lieutenant Morrison paced before them, his face hard as granite beneath his own soaked helmet. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word carried across the field despite the drumming rain, "in approximately 72 hours, you will board transport ships bound for France. Many of you will not return. Those who do will not be the same men standing before me now." He stopped pacing and looked directly at them, his eyes moving from face to face. "But every single one of you has a duty to your country, to your brothers in arms, and to the people back home who are counting on us to end this war. You are the liberators. You are the hope of the free world. Don't forget that when the bullets start flying. If you're enjoying this story about courage and sacrifice, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we share these important stories of heroism. Now let's continue with James's journey." James felt the words settle into his chest like stones, heavy and permanent. He thought of his mother back in Grand Island, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands, the way she'd looked at him the day he enlisted, proud and terrified in equal measure. He thought of his younger brother Tommy, only 14, who'd begged to go with him, who'd cried when James said no. He thought of Mary Ellen Carter, the girl who'd kissed him goodbye at the train station and promised to wait, her blue eyes shining with tears she wouldn't let fall until he was gone. These were the faces that appeared behind his eyelids when he tried to sleep, the voices that whispered through his dreams. They were why he was here, standing in the English rain, preparing to wade into hell. After Morrison dismissed them, James and his closest friend, Corporal Danny Kowalski from Chicago, trudged back toward their barracks. Danny was shorter than James by half a foot, stocky and strong, with dark hair and a perpetual stubble that no amount of shaving seemed to conquer. He'd been a steel worker before the war, and his hands showed it, scarred and calloused, capable hands that could strip a Browning automatic rifle blindfolded. "You ever wonder if we're actually ready for this?" Danny asked, keeping his voice low as they walked. Around them, other soldiers moved through the rain like ghosts, their faces set in expressions that ranged from determination to barely concealed fear. James didn't answer immediately. How could he? Ready seemed like a word that belonged to another language, another world. "I don't think anybody's ever ready to die," he finally said. "But we're ready to fight. That'll have to be enough." Danny kicked at a puddle, sending brown water splashing. "My old man fought in the Great War. Came back with half his hearing gone and nightmares that woke up the whole house. Never talked about it much, except one time when he'd had too much whiskey. Told me war isn't about being brave, it's about being too scared to let down the guy next to you." He looked at James. I figure he was right about that. They reached the barracks, a long wooden structure that smelled of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar odor of too many men living in too close quarters. Inside, soldiers were engaged in various activities, writing letters, cleaning weapons, playing cards, reading pocket Bibles or old magazines from home. The gramophone in the corner crackled out Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, and for a moment The music transformed the dreary barracks into something almost home-like. James sat on his bunk and pulled out his writing kit, paper, envelopes, and the fountain pen his father had given him before he left. The pen had belonged to his grandfather, carried through the Spanish-American War and somehow surviving intact. "Write the truth when you can," his father had said, pressing it into his palm. "But remember, sometimes the kindest truth is the one that gives people hope." He stared at the blank page for several minutes before beginning to write. "Dear Mom and Tommy, I hope this letter finds you both well and that the harvest came in good this year. We're still in England, but that's going to change soon. I can't say much about where we're going or when, but I want you to know that I'm with good men, the kind of men who would give their last canteen of water to a buddy who needed it, who share their cigarettes even when they're down to their last pack. We look after each other here. Mom, I know you worry. I can feel it even from across the ocean. But you raised me right, taught me the difference between what's easy and what's necessary. This war, stopping Hitler and his murderers, it's necessary. Every day we train, every mile we march, we're one step closer to making sure Tommy and kids like him never have to do this. That's worth something. That's worth everything. Tommy, I need you to be the man of the house while I'm gone. Help Mom with the heavy work, keep your grades up, and for God's sake, don't let old Mr. Henderson cheat you when you sell him eggs. He tried that with me too. Always claims his scale is accurate when it's not. Stand your ground, but be respectful about it. I carry your photograph with me everywhere, the one from last Christmas where we're all standing in front of the house. When things get tough, and they do get tough, I look at that picture and remember what I'm fighting for. Not just for you, but for every American family that deserves to live free, to sleep without fear, to build a future without the shadow of tyranny hanging over it. Tell Mary Ellen. I think of her every day. Tell her the stars over England are the same stars over Nebraska, and maybe, when she looks up at night, she'll know I'm looking up too, thinking of her. I'll write again as soon as I can. Keep the faith. Keep believing in what we're doing here. Know that whatever happens, I love you both more than words can say. Your son and brother, James. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and addressed it in his neatest handwriting. The mail call that evening would take it on the first leg of its journey across the Atlantic, where it would eventually find its way to the white farmhouse outside Grand Island, to his mother's hands. She would read it aloud to Tommy over dinner, her voice steady, even as her eyes filled with tears she'd wipe away before her youngest son could see. The next 3 days passed in a blur of final preparations. They waterproofed equipment, received ammunition allotments, attended briefings where officers pointed at maps and spoke in clipped, efficient tones about beachheads and objectives and acceptable casualty rates. James memorized his assembly point, his unit's recognition signals, the layout of the Normandy beaches they'd studied in endless detail. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, names that meant nothing until someone explained they represented miles of German fortifications, machine gun nests, artillery positions, mines and obstacles designed to turn the surf red with American blood. On the final night before embarkation, Father O'Brien, the unit chaplain, held a service in one of the empty warehouses. He was a small man from Boston, barely 5.5 feet tall, but his voice filled the space with warmth and certainty. Over 200 soldiers crowded into that warehouse, sitting on crates or standing along the walls, and Father O'Brien spoke to them not about victory or glory, but about faith, faith in God, faith in each other, faith in the righteousness of their cause. You men are about to become part of something greater than yourselves, Father O'Brien said, his Boston accent softening the hard consonants. You're about to write a chapter in the story of human freedom that people will remember for generations. Some of you will make it through without a scratch. Some of you will be wounded, and some of you will make the ultimate sacrifice." He paused, letting the words settle. "But every single one of you, every single one, will be a hero. Because you chose to stand up when the world needed you most. You said yes when you could have said no. You stepped forward when others stepped back. That's heroism in its purest form." After the service, soldiers lined up to speak with the chaplain, to receive his blessing, to confess sins, real or imagined, to find some measure of peace before the storm. James waited his turn, and when he finally stood before Father O'Brien, the chaplain smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "What's on your mind, son?" James struggled to find the words. "Father, I'm not scared of dying exactly, but I'm scared of dying without mattering, without making a difference." Father O'Brien's smile widened. "James, it is James, isn't it?" James nodded. "James, the fact that you're here, that you put on that uniform and trained for months to face an evil that threatens everything decent in this world, that already matters. You've already made a difference. Whatever happens in the days ahead, that truth remains. God sees you, your country sees you, and the people who love you see you. You matter." They boarded the transport ships before dawn on June 4, 1944. The English Channel stretched before them, grey and choppy under overcast skies. The ships bobbed and rolled, and within the first hour, half the men were seasick, leaning over rails or huddled over helmets, their faces green. James somehow avoided the worst of it, though his stomach lurched with every swell. He stood on deck as long as the officers allowed, watching England recede behind them, wondering if he'd ever see land again. The crossing took hours, though time seemed to lose all meaning in that narrow, crowded space below decks where hundreds of soldiers sat hip to hip, each man alone with his thoughts, despite being surrounded by others. Some prayed, some slept or pretended to sleep. Some wrote final letters that would only be mailed if they didn't survive. Danny sat next to James, methodically checking and rechecking his rifle, his ammunition, his grenades, anything to keep his hands busy. "You think it'll be as bad as they say?" Danny asked at one point, not looking up from his rifle. James had been asking himself the same question for weeks. "Probably worse," he answered honestly, "but we'll get through it. We have to." "Yeah," Danny said softly, "we have to." As darkness fell on June 5th, the armada assembled in the Channel grew larger, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of men toward the coast of France. James stood on deck again, having sweet-talked his way past a sergeant who looked the other way and watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness and the waves, German soldiers waited in concrete bunkers, their fingers on triggers, their orders clear. Stop the invasion at all costs. Somewhere out there, the beaches of Normandy waited, and with them, history. Lieutenant Morrison gathered the platoon together one final time before H-hour. They stood in a circle in the dim red light below decks, their faces shadowed and strange. "I won't lie to you," Morrison said, his voice rough with emotion he fought to control. "Tomorrow is going to test every one of us. You're going to see things that will stay with you forever. You're going to be asked to do things that seem impossible. But I want you to remember why we're here. We're here because back home, people are depending on us. We're here because freedom isn't free. Somebody has to pay for it. And we're here because we're Americans, and Americans don't back down from bullies, no matter how big they are or how many tanks they have." He looked around the circle, meeting each man's eyes. "Tomorrow, we storm those beaches. Tomorrow, we begin the liberation of Europe. Tomorrow, we show the world what Americans are made of. And God willing, tomorrow night we'll be standing on French soil, one step closer to Berlin and one step closer to ending this damn war. Stay close to each other, watch each other's backs, and remember, You're not just fighting for yourselves. You're fighting for every person who can't fight, for every child who deserves to grow up free, for every mother and father who want their kids to have a future. That's what's waiting on those beaches. That's what we're going to win." The men responded with a subdued hoo-ah, the traditional army affirmation, but underneath the word, James could hear the fear and determination mixed together in equal parts. They were ready as they'd ever be. At 200 hours on June 6, 1944, the landing craft began loading. James climbed down the rope nets that hung from the transport ship's side, his rifle slung across his back, his pack heavy with ammunition and supplies. The landing craft bobbed below, rising and falling with the waves, and timing the jump was everything. Too early and you'd fall 20 feet into the boat. Too late and you'd miss it entirely and plunge into the channel. He waited for the right moment, then dropped, his boots hitting the metal deck with a clang that jarred his knees. Around him, other soldiers dropped in one after another, until the landing craft was packed with 30 men, all facing forward toward the ramp that would drop them onto Omaha Beach. The Higgins boat's engine roared to life, and they pulled away from the transport ship, joining hundreds of other landing craft that formed waves of steel and courage, pushing toward the French coast. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky had begun to lighten in the east, turning from black to grey to a sickly yellow. James could see the coastline now, a dark line on the horizon that grew larger with each passing minute, and above that dark line he could see tracers arcing into the sky, explosions lighting up the dawn, the Navy's bombardment of German positions, thousands of shells pouring onto the beaches, trying to soften the defenses before the infantry landed. Danny stood next to James, his face pale but set. "This is it," he shouted over the engine noise and the wind and the distant thunder of artillery. "This is it," James agreed. The landing craft pitched and rolled, waves splashing over the sides, soaking everyone. Some men vomited over the rails, others prayed aloud or silently, lips moving with words only God could hear. James gripped his rifle and thought of home, of his mother's kitchen and Tommy's laugh and Mary Ellen's kiss. He thought of all the reasons he was here, all the reasons this mattered, and he made himself a promise, silent and solemn. If he died on this beach, it would be while moving forward, not backward. He would die as an American soldier, doing his duty, fighting for something bigger than himself. The beach was less than a mile away now. James could see the obstacles in the water. Wooden stakes tipped with mines, metal hedgehogs designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, concrete barriers and barbed wire. Behind those obstacles, the beach rose toward bluffs where German bunkers waited, their machine guns already firing into the first waves of boats. Men were dying out there right now, falling in the surf or on the sand, but the boats kept coming, kept pushing forward because there was no turning back, no other choice. Forward was the only direction that mattered. The coxswain, piloting their Higgins boat, shouted something James couldn't hear, and then the boat lurched as it hit a sandbar. They were 50 yards from shore, maybe less. The ramp started to drop, and Lieutenant Morrison, standing at the front, turned to face them one last time. "Let's go," he shouted. "Move fast and move forward. God bless America." The ramp splashed down into waist-deep water, and Morrison charged out, his Thompson submachine gun raised. James followed, Danny right beside him, and 30 men plunged into the channel. The water was so cold it stole his breath, and the weight of his pack tried to drag him under, but he kept his footing, kept pushing toward the beach through water that turned pink with blood from boats that had landed seconds before. Machine gun fire chattered across the water, kicking up small fountains where bullets struck. Men fell around him, some crying out, some silent, and James ran with everything he had, his boots finding purchase in the sand as the water grew shallower. He made it to the beach and threw himself down behind a metal obstacle, gasping for air. his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Danny landed next to him, water streaming from his uniform. "You hit?" Danny shouted. James checked himself quickly, arms, legs, torso, everything still attached, still working. "No, you? I'm good. We need to move. Can't stay here." Morrison was already rallying men, pointing toward the bluffs, toward the German positions that needed to be taken. "Engineers, get those obstacles cleared. Infantry, on me. We're taking that bunker." He pointed at a concrete pillbox 200 yards up the beach, its machine gun traversing back and forth, cutting down anyone who tried to advance. James and Danny ran forward with a dozen other soldiers, zigzagging across the sand, jumping over bodies and debris and craters. Explosions erupted around them, mortar rounds, artillery shells, mines. The noise was deafening, inhuman, a constant roar that drowned out everything except the need to move, to survive, to fight. A corporal named Stevens, who'd trained with them in England, stepped on a mine 10 feet to James's left. The explosion lifted him off his feet and threw him backward, and when James glanced over, Stevens wasn't moving, wasn't anything anymore. They reached the base of the bluffs and pressed themselves against the slope, breathing hard, trying to find any cover from the machine gun fire that swept the beach. Morrison counted heads. Only 8 men left from their 30. 22 dead or wounded in the first 5 minutes, but there was no time to grieve, no time for anything except the mission. Morrison pulled out a grenade, looked at his remaining soldiers and said, "We're going up that hill, we're taking that bunker, and then we're pushing inland, understood?" "Yes, sir," they shouted back, and they went up. They climbed that bluff under fire, using whatever handholds they could find, rocks and roots and sheer determination. James's hands bled from gripping sharp stones. His lungs burned from the exertion and the smoke and the fear. But he kept climbing, Danny above him, Morrison leading the way, and when they reached the top, they were behind the bunker, exposed to its rear entrance, where German soldiers were reloading their machine gun. Morrison didn't hesitate. He pulled the pin on his grenade and threw it through the bunker's opening. The explosion inside was muffled, but effective. The machine gun went silent. Morrison rushed in with his Thompson, and James and Danny followed, their rifles ready. 3 German soldiers lay dead inside. A 4th, wounded, reached for his pistol, and Danny shot him before James could think. They were alive. They had taken their first objective, and as James looked out from the bunker, over the beach below, over the carnage and chaos and courage, over the landing craft still coming in despite everything, he understood in his bones what Father O'Brien had meant. This was heroism, not glory or excitement, but ordinary men doing impossible things because their country asked it of them, because freedom demanded it, because there was no other choice. The battle for Omaha Beach lasted all day. James and his squad fought from bunker to bunker, clearing German positions, pushing inland meter by meter. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, they had secured a toehold in France. Thousands had died to gain that toehold, Americans, British, Canadians, but they had done it. The liberation of Europe had begun. James sat that night in a captured German trench, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever known. Danny passed him a canteen, and James drank, the water tasting like life itself. Around them, other survivors huddled in small groups, sharing cigarettes, tending wounds, trying to process what they'd lived through. Tomorrow they would push further inland. Tomorrow they would fight again. But tonight they had survived. They had done their duty. They had proven themselves worthy of the sacrifice. Before he closed his eyes to sleep, James pulled out the photograph of his family and looked at it by the light of a distant burning tank. His mother, Tommy, the farmhouse. Mary Ellen, home. "We made it, Mom," he whispered to the photograph. "We're in France. We're winning." And though she couldn't hear him, Though an ocean separated them, he knew somehow that she felt it, felt that he was still alive, still fighting, still her son. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare of combat that tested every soldier in ways training never could. The hedgerow country of Normandy turned out to be perfectly suited for defence, every field bordered by ancient earthen walls, topped with thick bushes, creating natural fortifications that German soldiers used to devastating effect. James's unit, what remained of it, pushed forward through this maze of death, taking casualties with every advance, gaining ground measured in yards rather than miles. By mid-June, they had lost so many men that replacements arrived almost daily. Fresh-faced boys straight from England who hadn't experienced combat, who looked at the veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. James tried not to learn their names too quickly. It hurt less that way when they died, and they died frequently. The new soldiers made mistakes, froze at the wrong moments, exposed themselves when they should have taken cover, but some learned fast, adapted, became good soldiers. Those were the ones James allowed himself to know. One replacement, a kid from Virginia named Bobby Hutchins, attached himself to James almost immediately. He was 18, barely old enough to shave, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. "My dad said to find the guy who looks like he knows what he's doing and stick close to him," Bobby explained, the first night he joined them. "You look like you know what you're doing." Danny laughed at that, a bitter sound. "Mitchell here knows how to stay alive. That's about all any of us know." James didn't send Bobby away. The kid reminded him of Tommy, and maybe having someone to look after gave him a purpose beyond just survival. So he taught Bobby what he'd learned, how to spot a German sniper position, how to move quietly through underbrush, where to dig your foxhole and how deep, which sounds meant incoming artillery and which meant outgoing. Simple things that meant the difference between living and dying. They fought through the hedgerows for 6 weeks, brutal close-quarters combat where you sometimes couldn't see the enemy until you were 10 feet away. James killed men during those weeks. How many, he didn't count, didn't want to count. Each time, he told himself they were soldiers like him, following orders, fighting for their country. Each time, he pushed away the thought that they had mothers too, brothers, girlfriends waiting for letters that would never come. You couldn't think about that and remain sane. You couldn't see the enemy as human and still pull the trigger when you needed to. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began, the breakout from Normandy. American bombers saturated German positions with thousands of tons of explosives, and then the armor rolled forward, tanks and infantry working together to punch through German lines. James's unit advanced in the wake of the armor, securing towns and villages, mopping up resistance, pushing eastward toward Paris. They liberated a small French town called Saint-Lô on August 2nd. The place was barely more than ruins, every building damaged or destroyed by weeks of fighting, rubble filling the streets, craters where bombs had fallen. But the French civilians who emerged from cellars and basements looked at the American soldiers like they were angels descended from heaven. Old men wept and shook their hands. Women kissed their cheeks and pressed flowers into their hands. Children followed them through the streets, chattering in French, begging for chocolate or cigarettes. An elderly Frenchman approached James as they set up a temporary camp in the town square. He wore a threadbare suit that had probably been fine once, and he carried himself with dignity despite the circumstances. "Américain?" he asked. "Yes, sir," James replied. The man's eyes filled with tears. He clasped James's hand in both of his and spoke in heavily accented English. "Thank you. Thank you. 4 years we wait, 4 years we pray, and now you come. You free us. Thank you." James didn't know what to say. The gratitude felt too heavy, too much. They'd just been doing their jobs, following orders. But looking into this man's eyes, seeing the relief and joy there, he understood for the first time the full weight of what they were accomplishing. This wasn't just about defeating Germany, it was about restoring hope, returning freedom, giving people back their lives. "You're welcome, sir," James finally managed. "We're honored to help." That night, sitting in a ruined building with Danny and Bobby and half a dozen other soldiers, James wrote another letter home. His hands shook slightly as he held the pen, whether from exhaustion or emotion, he couldn't say. "Dear Mom and Tommy, I'm somewhere in France now, and I can tell you that because we've moved far enough that the censors won't black it out. We've been fighting since the landing, and I won't lie, it's been hard. Harder than anything I could have imagined. But we're winning, Mom. We're actually winning. Today, we liberated a town that's been under German occupation for 4 years. The French people here, you should have seen their faces. They looked at us like we'd performed a miracle. An old man thanked me with tears running down his cheeks. He said they'd prayed for this day, and now it had finally come. I keep thinking about what you taught me, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. I understand now what you meant. Freedom isn't something that just exists on its own. People have to fight for it, sometimes die for it. And that's what we're doing here. We're fighting so that people can live without fear, without tyranny. We're fighting for the same things our founders fought for back in 1776, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've made good friends here. Danny, who I've mentioned before, is like a brother to me. We look out for each other. And there's a young soldier named Bobby who reminds me of Tommy. I try to teach him what I've learned, try to keep him safe. It helps, having people to care about. It makes the hard days bearable. Tommy, you asked in your last letter if I'm scared. The answer is yes, every day. But being scared doesn't mean giving up. It means pushing through the fear to do what needs to be done. Remember that. Whatever challenges you face in life, being afraid is okay. Letting fear stop you, that's what you can't do. Tell Mary Ellen I carry her photograph next to my heart. Tell her I dream of the day I can come home and take her dancing like I promised. Tell her I'm going to make it through this because I have too much to live for to die now. The stars here look the same as they do over Nebraska, just like I said before. When you look up tonight, know that I'm looking up too, thinking of you, loving you, fighting to make sure we can all be together again soon. Your son and brother, James. August melted into September as the Allied advance continued. James's division fought through northern France, crossed into Belgium, liberated towns with names he couldn't pronounce. The Germans fought desperate rearguard actions, but they were retreating, always retreating. Victory seemed close enough to taste. But war has a way of punishing optimism. In mid-September, near the Belgian town of Hurtgen, everything changed. The Germans had decided to make a stand in the dense woodland that straddled the German-Belgian border, the Hurtgen forest. The forest was ancient, dark and forbidding, even in peacetime. In war, it became a green hell. James's unit entered the Hurtgen on September 19th, part of a larger operation to clear German forces and advance toward the Rhine River. The forest canopy was so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, and the underbrush was nearly impenetrable. Visibility dropped to a few yards at best. Artillery shells hitting the trees created deadly airbursts that sent shrapnel and wooden splinters raining down. Mines were everywhere. German soldiers fought from carefully prepared positions, and every step forward cost American lives. They fought in that forest for weeks, and it devoured men like a beast that could never be satisfied. James watched friends die in ways he couldn't have imagined. Killed by tree bursts, blown apart by mines, picked off by snipers they never saw. The cold and constant rain sapped their strength. Trench foot became epidemic. Supplies ran low. And still they pushed forward because those were the orders, because somebody had decided this forest was worth taking no matter the cost. On October 4th, Bobby Hutchins died. They were advancing on a German machine gun nest when Bobby stepped on a mine. The explosion threw him into the air, and when James reached him, the kid was conscious, but fading fast. His legs were gone below the knees, and blood soaked the forest floor around him. "I'm sorry," Bobby whispered, looking up at James with frightened eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have watched where I stepped. You told me to watch." James cradled the boy's head in his lap, applying pressure to wounds that couldn't be fixed. "Not here, not in time." "You did fine, Bobby. You did real fine. You're a good soldier. Will you tell my mom?" Bobby's voice was getting weaker. "Tell her I wasn't scared at the end." "You bet, kid. I'll tell her." Bobby died less than a minute later, his hand clutching James's, his eyes going empty and distant. James stayed with him for several minutes after, unable to move, unable to process that this boy who'd reminded him so much of Tommy was gone, just like that. His life ended in a random moment on a random day in a forest that most people back home had never heard of. Danny found him there and gently pulled him away. "Come on, Mitch, we've got to keep moving. You know the drill." James knew the drill, but knowing didn't make it easier. He took Bobby's dog tags and added them to the collection he'd been keeping, metal reminders of the men who hadn't made it. Someday, when this was over, he'd make sure their families got these tags, got some piece of their sons and brothers back. They finally broke out of the Hurtgen forest in late November, but James's division had been decimated. Of the 200 men who'd gone in, fewer than 50 came out uninjured. Lieutenant Morrison had been killed by artillery fire in mid-October. The cheerful coxswain who'd driven their landing craft on D-Day had died of infection after being wounded by a mine. The sergeant who'd looked the other way when James wanted to stand on deck during the Channel crossing had frozen to death in a foxhole during a particularly brutal night, but they kept fighting, through Belgium into Germany itself by December. The German border towns were fortified positions, each one requiring days of brutal urban combat to clear. The Germans fought harder defending their homeland, and James couldn't entirely blame them. If someone invaded America, he'd fight to the last breath too. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched a massive counter-offensive in the Ardennes, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. James's division wasn't directly in the path of the attack, but they were quickly repositioned to help contain the German breakthrough. They fought through snow and sub-zero temperatures, battling frostbite and exhaustion along with the enemy. The cold was unlike anything James had experienced even in Nebraska winters, a wet, penetrating cold that seeped into your bones and wouldn't leave. Danny developed pneumonia in early January. He tried to hide it, tried to keep fighting, but eventually he collapsed during a march. James helped get him to an aid station, where a harried doctor took one listen to his lungs and shook his head. "He needs to be evacuated," the doctor said. "If he stays in the line, he'll die." "I'm fine," Danny protested weakly. "Just need some rest." "You need a hospital," the doctor insisted. He looked at James. "Make him understand. He's no good to anyone dead." So James sat with his best friend and told him the truth. "You've done your part, Danny, more than your part. You fought on D-Day. You fought through France and Belgium and into Germany. You've earned the right to go home." What about you?" Danny's voice was rough with infection. "I'll be fine. I've got this far, haven't I?" They evacuated Danny the next morning. James watched the ambulance drive away, taking his closest friend to safety, and felt a mixture of relief and loneliness. Relief because Danny might actually survive this war now. Loneliness because the man who'd stood beside him through everything was gone, and James was truly on his own. The Battle of the Bulge was finally contained by late January. The Germans had gambled everything on one last offensive and lost. Now they were in full retreat, falling back toward the Rhine, toward the heart of Germany. Victory was coming. James could feel it. But at what cost? How many more would die before Hitler finally surrendered? In February, James's decimated division was pulled back for rest and refit. They spent 2 weeks in a Belgian town that had been liberated months earlier, sleeping in real beds for the first time in half a year, eating hot meals, trying to remember what it felt like to be human instead of just a soldier. Replacement troops arrived to fill their ranks, young men who hadn't seen combat yet, who looked at the veterans with careful respect. James was promoted to sergeant during this period, given his own squad to lead. The promotion came with a brief ceremony where a colonel he'd never met before pinned new stripes on his uniform and said something about valor and leadership. James barely heard the words. He was thinking about all the men who should have been promoted instead. Morrison, Stevens, Bobby Hutchins, all the others who'd never get to wear sergeant stripes because they were dead. But he accepted the promotion because that's what you did. And he took his responsibilities seriously, drilling his new squad in everything he'd learned, trying to prepare them for what was coming. Some of them listened. Some of them thought they knew better. The ones who listened had a better chance of surviving. In March, they crossed the Rhine River on a pontoon bridge, while German artillery tried unsuccessfully to destroy it. They were in the industrial heartland of Germany now, fighting through cities and towns, encountering scenes of destruction beyond anything James had witnessed before. The Allied bombing campaign had reduced much of Germany to rubble. Civilians huddled in basements, afraid of both their own government and the approaching American army. Refugee columns clogged the roads, people fleeing westward, trying to escape the advancing Soviet forces to the east. On April 10th, James's division came upon Buchenwald concentration camp. Nothing in his life had prepared him for what he saw there. The skeletal prisoners, barely alive, who stared at them with hollow eyes. The crematoria still smouldering with the remains of murdered innocents. The piles of personal belongings, shoes, glasses, suitcases, each representing a life stolen, a family destroyed. The sheer scope of the evil perpetrated in this place overwhelmed the mind's capacity to process it. James stood in that camp and understood, finally and completely, why they were fighting. This was what they were stopping. This was the darkness they were holding back. Every soldier who died, from Omaha Beach to the Hurtgen Forest to here, had died to end this. Their sacrifice had meaning, had purpose. They had literally saved the world from a monstrous evil. He took photographs that day, using a camera he'd picked up from a dead German officer months ago. He took photographs because he knew people back home needed to see this, needed to understand what their sons and brothers had died fighting against. This wasn't just war. This was a crusade for human decency. A prisoner approached James, a man who couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, with numbers tattooed on his arm and eyes that had seen too much. He spoke in broken English, his voice a whisper. "You are American." "Yes," James managed to say past the lump in his throat. "You came," the man said, and tears ran down his face. "We prayed you would come. We prayed, and we died, and we prayed more. And you came." He gripped James's hand with fingers that felt like bird bones. Thank you for saving us." But James didn't feel like a savior. He felt like he'd arrived too late, like all the fighting and dying had been too slow, like they should have gotten here years ago before so many had died. He looked around at the camp, at the survivors who weren't sure they'd actually survived, at the evidence of evil beyond his comprehension, and something fundamental shifted inside him. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. James heard the news while his division was camped outside a small German town whose name he never learned. The war was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. After 11 months of combat, after watching hundreds of friends die, after killing more enemy soldiers than he wanted to remember, it was finally over. The celebration that night was muted. Yes, men drank and sang and fired weapons into the air, but mostly they sat quietly, trying to absorb the fact that they had survived, that they were going home. James sat apart from the celebration, looking up at the stars, those same stars that hung over Nebraska, over his mother's farmhouse, over Mary Ellen's window. "We did it," he whispered to the night. "It's over. We won." They remained in Germany through the summer as occupation forces, helping to establish order, processing German prisoners, beginning the long task of rebuilding a shattered continent. James wrote long letters home, trying to explain what he'd experienced, what he'd seen, what he'd done. Some of it he could write about. Much of it he kept to himself, locked away in corners of memory he hoped would fade with time, but knew never would. In August, news came that Japan had surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war, the whole war, was over. James would be going home. Actually going home, back to Nebraska, back to his mother and Tommy and Mary Ellen, back to a life where people didn't die every day, where the sound of artillery didn't fill your dreams, where you could walk down a street without watching for mines. The journey home took weeks. They sailed from France in late September, another transport ship packed with soldiers, but this time the mood was completely different. No one was afraid. No one was preparing for battle. They were just going home, and that simple fact made everything bearable. James stood on deck for hours, watching the Atlantic pass beneath the bow, thinking about everything that had happened since he'd left Nebraska 18 months ago. He was 21 years old, but he felt ancient. He'd seen too much, done too much. Could he go back to being a farmer's son? Could he pretend that the last year and a half hadn't changed him fundamentally? He didn't know, but he was going to try. They docked in New York on October 15th, 1945. The Statue of Liberty rose before them in the harbor, her torch held high, and when James saw her, tears ran down his face for the first time since Bobby Hutchins had died. This was America. This was home. This was what they'd fought for, what so many had died for, and he had made it back. Against all odds, through all the battles and the bullets and the chance encounters with death, he had made it back. The army processed them quickly, eager to demobilize the millions of soldiers who were no longer needed. James received his discharge papers, his back pay, and a train ticket to Grand Island, Nebraska. He said goodbye to the men he'd fought with, exchanging addresses and promises to stay in touch that they all knew probably wouldn't be kept. War friendships were different from regular friendships, intense and immediate, forged in shared danger, but hard to maintain once the danger was gone. The train ride across America took 3 days. James watched the country roll past his window, cities and farms, mountains and plains, rivers and forests. It all looked the same and completely different. He'd left this country as a boy and was returning as a man who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer and somehow survived it. How did you bridge that gap? How did you explain to people who'd been safe at home what it was like to fight and die for freedom? He wasn't sure you could. Maybe you just moved forward and tried to build something good with the time you'd been given. The train pulled into Grand Island Station on October 18th at 3:47 in the afternoon. James gathered his duffel bag and stepped onto the platform. And there they were. His mother, Tommy, Mary Ellen, all waiting for him, scanning the crowd of arriving soldiers. His mother saw him first. She let out a cry and ran to him, and then he was holding her, feeling her tears on his shoulder, hearing her thank God over and over. Tommy crashed into them a moment later, taller than James remembered, 14 now and nearly a man himself. And then Mary Ellen was there, beautiful Mary Ellen, with her blue eyes and soft hands, and she kissed him right there on the platform, while people around them cheered. "You came back," she whispered against his lips. "You really came back." "Promised I would," James said. They drove home in his father's old truck. His father had died of a heart attack while James was overseas. Another piece of news that had reached him months late, and his mother pointed out everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. But James barely heard her. He was too busy looking at the familiar landscape, the flat Nebraska plains stretching to the horizon, the farmhouses dotting the countryside, the clear blue sky unmarred by smoke or explosions. Peace. This was what peace looked like. This was what they'd won. That night, over dinner in the farmhouse kitchen, Tommy asked the question James had been dreading. What was it like? The war. James looked at his brother, at his mother, at Mary Ellen sitting beside him with her hand in his. How could he answer that? How could he describe Omaha Beach, the Hürtgen Forest, Buchenwald? How could he make them understand what it cost to preserve the freedom they took for granted? It was hard, he finally said, the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was necessary, and we won. That's what matters. Did you? Tommy hesitated. Did you have to kill people? Tommy, their mother said sharply. But James shook his head. It's okay, Mom. He deserves an answer. He looked at Tommy. Yes, I killed enemy soldiers, men who were trying to kill me and my friends, men who were part of a system that murdered millions of innocent people. I wish I hadn't had to, but I did what was necessary to protect my country and end the war. That's what soldiers do. They didn't press him for more details, and he was grateful. Over the following weeks and months, James tried to readjust to civilian life. He helped Tommy with the farm work. He courted Mary Ellen properly, taking her to dances and movies, acting like a normal young man in love. He attended church services where the priests spoke about God's mercy and the triumph of good over evil. He applied to the University of Nebraska on the GI Bill, thinking he might become a teacher, but the nightmares came almost every night. He'd wake up screaming, back in the Hürtgen Forest or storming Omaha Beach, watching Bobby die again and again. Mary Ellen held him through those nights after they got married in June 1946, whispering that he was safe, that he was home, that the war was over. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent, though they never completely disappeared. James and Mary Ellen had 4 children over the next decade, 3 boys and a girl. He raised them to understand the value of freedom, the importance of standing up for what's right, the cost that previous generations had paid to give them the life they enjoyed. He told them about the war, not the graphic details, but the important truths. He told them about the men who died, about why they'd died, about what they'd accomplished. He made sure his children understood that freedom wasn't free. He stayed in touch with Danny Kowalski, who'd survived his pneumonia and returned to Chicago. They exchanged Christmas cards every year and visited a few times when they could afford it. They never talked about the war much during those visits. They didn't need to. They'd been there together. They understood. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, James traveled to Normandy with a group of veterans. They visited the beaches where they'd landed, now peaceful and tourist-friendly, and they walked through the American cemetery where thousands of their brothers in arms lay buried beneath white crosses and stars of David. James found Bobby Hutchins's grave and knelt before it. "I kept my promise, kid," he said softly. "I told your mom you weren't scared, and I told my children about you, about how brave you were. They know your name. They'll remember you. You didn't die for nothing." He lived to be 91 years old, James Mitchell, the farm boy from Grand Island who'd stormed Omaha Beach and fought across Europe, who'd seen the worst of humanity and somehow held on to faith in the best. He died peacefully in his sleep on a summer night in 2014, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who'd heard his stories and knew they were part of something larger than themselves. He died knowing he'd done his duty, that he'd served his country when it needed him most, that his life had mattered. At his funeral, his oldest son read from a letter James had written years earlier to be opened after his death. "To my family and all who read this, I was just one soldier among millions, one man who answered when his country called. I did nothing extraordinary. I simply tried to do my duty, to help my fellow soldiers, and to survive long enough to come home. But the men I served with, the men who didn't make it home, they were extraordinary. They gave everything so that others could live free. Remember them, honor them, and never forget that freedom always comes at a cost, usually paid by those who return home, changed forever, or don't return at all. Be worthy of their sacrifice. Build the kind of country they died defending. Make their deaths mean something by living lives of purpose, courage, and compassion. That's all any of us can do. That's all any of us should do." If you've made it this far in James's story, thank you for honoring his memory and the memory of all who served. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from and what this story means to you. These stories of sacrifice and heroism need to be told and remembered. The American flags that flew at half-mast over Grand Island on the day of James Mitchell's funeral represented more than just one man's passing. They represented a generation, the greatest generation as they came to be known, who had answered their nation's call in its darkest hour and prevailed against tyranny. James was one of millions who'd put on a uniform, crossed an ocean, and fought in battles whose names would echo through history: Normandy, Ardennes, Remagen, Bastogne. But James's story also represented something more personal, more universal. It was the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because circumstances demanded it. He hadn't been born brave. He'd been scared every day of the war. But he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite fear, putting others before yourself, holding the line when every instinct screamed at you to run. His children and grandchildren scattered his ashes in 2 places he'd requested. Half went into the Nebraska soil he'd worked and loved, the land he'd fought to protect. The other half went into the Atlantic Ocean near Normandy, close to the beaches where he'd landed on that June morning in 1944, where so many of his brothers had died. The waves carried those ashes toward shore, toward the monuments and cemeteries that stood as testament to American sacrifice, toward the ground hallowed by blood and consecrated by courage. Years later, James's oldest grandson, Mark, joined the army and deployed to Afghanistan. Before he left, he stood at the grave marker in the Grand Island Cemetery where James was memorialized. The ashes were scattered, but the family had placed a stone there anyway, a place to visit and remember. Mark wore his grandfather's dog tags alongside his own. "I understand now, Grandpa," Mark said to the stone. "I understand what you tried to tell us about duty and service and why it matters. I'll make you proud. I'll uphold the standard you set." And in that moment, standing before a memorial to a man who'd fought and survived World War II, Mark represented the continuity of American ideals, the understanding that each generation must be willing to defend freedom, that sacrifice is sometimes necessary, that the price of liberty must be paid anew by those who inherit it. James Mitchell's promise to die for his country and live forever in its memory was kept. Not because he died, he survived after all, but because he lived with honor, served with distinction, and passed on the values that had sustained him through war and peace. He lived forever in the memories of his family, in the stories his grandchildren told their children, in the example he set of what it meant to be an American when America needed its citizens most. On the wall of his grandson's home hangs a photograph taken on VE Day in 1945. It shows a young James Mitchell, dirt-smudged and exhausted, standing with Danny Kowalski and 3 other soldiers whose names no one remembers anymore. They're not smiling in the photo. They just looked tired, bone deep, soul tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving when you expected to die, from carrying the weight of those who didn't make it. But in their eyes, you can see something else: determination, pride, the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. That photograph is part of James's legacy, as are the bronze star and Purple Heart displayed in a shadow box beside it. But the real legacy isn't in medals or photographs. It's in the freedoms we enjoy today, the world order established by that generation's sacrifices, the understanding that democracy and liberty must be defended by people willing to fight for them. James never called himself a hero. He'd always say he was just doing what needed to be done, what any American would have done in his place. But that humility, that inability to see his own extraordinary courage as anything special, was perhaps the most heroic thing about him. He represented the best of America: practical, determined, willing to sacrifice for others, humble in victory, generous in peace. The farm where James grew up and eventually raised his own family still stands outside Grand Island. It's owned by his youngest son now, who plants corn and soybeans in the same fields his father worked. Sometimes, when the wind blows across those fields in summer, carrying the smell of growing things and promise, you can almost imagine a young James Mitchell walking between the rows, thinking about the future, dreaming about what lay beyond the Nebraska horizon. He found out what lay beyond that horizon. He saw both the best and worst of what humanity could do. And when he came home, he tried to make that sacrifice mean something by building a good life, raising good children, contributing to his community. He voted in every election. He served on the town council for 12 years. He volunteered with the WWII, helping other veterans adjust to civilian life, making sure the younger generation understood the lessons paid for in blood. On the 4th of July every year, James would stand for the national anthem with his hand over his heart, and tears would run down his face. His children used to ask him why he cried, and he'd tell them, "Because I remember what it cost to keep that flag flying. I remember the men who'll never stand for another anthem. This isn't just a song to me, it's a promise we made and kept." That promise echoes through the decades. Every soldier who serves honors James Mitchell's memory, whether they know his name or not. Every American who exercises their right to vote, to speak freely, to worship as they choose, benefits from the sacrifice made by James and millions like him. Every generation that grows up in peace owes a debt to the generation that endured war. James Mitchell died believing in America, believing in the cause he'd fought for, believing that the sacrifice had been worth it. In his final years, he'd sometimes express concern about younger generations who seemed to take freedom for granted, who didn't understand the cost of the liberties they enjoyed. But he never lost hope. He'd seen America at its best, ordinary citizens rising to meet extraordinary challenges, and he believed that spirit lived on, dormant perhaps, but ready to emerge.